Dr. Andreas and the other speakers this evening. Those are very tough presentations to follow. Dr. Andreas and I agree completely with you on the healthcare issue. I mean, we have got to get back private enterprise in healthcare. That's the only way that we can limit the cost. Of course, there's a whole lot more to it, too. If you put it down into language that all of us can understand, and in fact, probably language that I'll use out on the campaign trail as I campaign against one of the biggest, I think, power grabs of the federal government in recent history. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, but when we talk about restoration, we've got to know about where we come from. I mean, that's the first step to understand what you're restoring back to. And, you know, the idea that we're an exceptional nation, we've got to kind of get roots to it. What that means is we are a nation that's founded on the concept of having fundamental rights and liberties that aren't given to us by government, but they come from natural law or they come from God. And that's what our founders understood. And they understood that freedom was the base of our nation and its liberty and its ability to move forward. And also understood, our founders also understood, that the biggest single threat to that liberty is government. And so a constitutional restraint that was designed to restrain the federal government. That really is the overarching intent. And we had the Articles of Confederation initially, which led to a weak central government that couldn't provide for some of the really basic needs of the federal government. But still, the fundamental view of the Constitution was how to restrain government so that our rights would be protected. And so our founders came up with the idea of enumerated rights. A Bill of Rights was attached to the document that said in the 10th Amendment that if it's not enumerated in the Constitution, those powers are reserved to the people and to the states. And yet we've gotten to a point today, fast forward 200 and some odd years later, where there seems to be no limits to federal power. And we kind of scratch our heads and ask ourselves, how can we be at this point where today we have more active people in politics that have never had anything to do with politics before because of what's happening? I mean, it is just gargantuan. We've got this huge debt. We've got these agencies that are overarching, that are getting their hands in every area of our lives that they aren't entitled to be in. And there are a lot of different examples of that. We can talk about Obamacare. We can talk about, you know, the wood in our wood stoves in Fairbanks, where now because of federal mandates, you can't burn wood in your stoves, although we kind of reversed that a bit by a vote we took recently up in Fairbanks. But still, the federal government is involved in areas that it was never intended to be in. And it has expanded at every step. You know, more recently, we saw the expansion of Obamacare. Dr. Andreas has put it out there clearly. One of the figures that's involved with Obamacare is 20%. Almost 20% of the federal economy now is getting under the mandate or under the control of the federal government. Yet just another area for the federal government to screw up and create inefficiency, create more debt for what I call generational theft. We take money from future generations to satisfy our own excesses, to satisfy what our federal government thinks is best for us at this time, but it's not right. So how did we get there? We got this document that clearly was designed to restrain the government, and now we're at a point where the federal government thinks that there is no restraint. Well, it was done by reinterpreting the Constitution, and that's been a progressive change over the last 150 or so years. It hasn't happened all at once, although in recent decades it's been worse than earlier decades. I remember back in 1987, that was the 200th year anniversary of the Constitution, where the Department of Education had a really aggressive education program where it talked about how the Constitution was a living, breathing, growing, evolving document, trying to basically educate the kids of this nation. Look, that Constitution can mean whatever the Supreme Court says it means. And they used the excuse that our founders intended that. Well, of course they didn't. What the founders intended was that it means what it says and what the founders intended it to mean. And if you want to change it, you've got to go through a process, an amendment process, where you get a proposed amendment. It can be proposed several ways, but it's got to be ratified by the states. Pretty high threshold. 3/4 of the states, but that's the way you change it. You don't go in and say that actually at any time the people on the bench can determine what it says. But that's what's happening. And so part of the changes that happened included looking at the Commerce Clause and saying the Commerce Clause, which was intended to be the power of the federal government to make sure there was free trade between the states, it now means that anything that happens within a state that has any impact on commerce, no matter how minor, can be regulated by the federal government. Of course, we've got the tax power as well. And so now the federal government thinks it can act wherever it wants. But the neat thing about what's happening today is that people understand that that's not what was intended. I mean, I see more constitutions in people's pockets now walking across the state. Even when you go to the lower 48 and you get involved in political rallies, people have the Constitution. They look at it, they read it, they know it, and they understand that, hey, this doesn't match quite up with what we're doing here today. And that's gotten people active. And I think that's one of the major things. It's not just you know, this understanding that government has gone way beyond the scope. It's also these other factors that have come into where we see now that with respect to Obamacare, government takeover, we look at Obamacare. Many of you probably now are aware of the 1099 requirement under Obamacare. If you're a small businessman or woman, I can assure you you're aware of it. Any transaction, $600 or above, is now reportable. Even a church has to do this. And so you've got this tremendous administrative load that's going to be imposed upon this country next year that's going to create all the more burden, it's going to create all the more power to government. The IRS is going to know all the more. You know, if you want to go out there and buy an ounce of gold, that's reportable now because that's over $600. The government's going to know you did it. Doesn't matter what you buy, over $600 reportable. It's just a huge power grab, and it's also a huge cost to business. I think government also, another reason why people are engaged, government and its regulation puts down free enterprise. I mean, that's the base of this country.